And she had nothing to tell me. She didn't know what to tell me. And she just stood there crying. And I remember we had a ceasefire for 2 hours. And we sat in the corner of our bomb shelter, my father, my mother, and I. And we held each other's hands and we said the Lord's prayers. And my parents said to me, when they come to kill us tonight, we will create a distraction. You just run towards Israel and you never look back. And I remember sobbing as a little girl, holding their hands, saying, how can I leave you? What is my life without you? I don't want to live without you. And they said, we lived a long life. You just run and never look back. Thank God I did not have to make that decision that night, because that's the night Israel came in physically into Lebanon and established a security zone in what was called Operation Litani. And they pushed away the Palestinians away from our area and established security points with cannons and big artillery bases around the hills surrounding our town to basically protect us and prevent the Palestinians and the Muslims from coming to our town. And this went on for another 5 years. Meanwhile, we organized our lives. People ask me so many times, how did you go to school? And this is how I went to school. I was picked up in a tank. You know those tanks you see on television with the big cannon? You can fit 18 children inside that tank. This is how I went to school, literally. And many days we would be at school, and they made the school the first floor of the schools, and they stuck all the kids. We were sitting on top of each other, and the teacher would come, and by 10:30 we would hear on the radio that we're going to be attacked, and the principal will come storming into our classroom. Run like heck, we're going to be bombed in 15 minutes. And everybody will just disperse. And I remember many days running back to my bomb shelter with my books on top of my head, hiding my head from shrapnels as the bombs started falling around me before I made it to the bomb shelter. This was my life, and this was our life. And in 1982, the Christians and the Israelis were fed up with the Palestinians, with the terrorist organizations in Lebanon. In 1982, we had 11 Muslim terrorist organizations in Lebanon. 11, other than the PLO. And we were fed up with it. And Israel was working with the Christians to basically help the Christians take back their country. And Israel was not only working with the Christians in the south, but Israel was helping the Christians in Beirut and the other side of Lebanon. And the reason why Israel went into Lebanon is because Syria and Iran had gotten involved in the war, and Syria was bombing Israel using Lebanese territories, calling it the Lebanese resistance, while we had nothing to do with it. And Israel came into Lebanon. Boy, sounds like I'm talking about last year. And Israel came into Lebanon just to push away the Syrian cannons and the Palestinians and their sympathizers away from our areas and push them out of Lebanon so the Christians can be able to build back their democracy and take back their country and sign a peace treaty with Israel. And this is when the peace negotiations began. But sadly, in that process, as Israel invaded Lebanon, my mother became wounded by a Muslim shell exploding in front of our bomb shelter as she was running to the bomb shelter. As the Muslims were retrieving, they were bombing us. It was like rain. We had to take my mother to an Israeli hospital for treatment. For my mother, it was a life-saving experience. It literally saved her life. For me, it was a life-changing experience. Because up to that point, I knew since I was 10 years old that Israel saved our life. Israel was our friend. I didn't think of them as the enemy because, under 10 years old, you really don't have that much of an opinion. But after 10 years old, I knew they were our friends. But it wasn't until I went to Israel with my mother and I was alone for those 22 days in the hospital that changed my life. I remember, before we left to the hospital to give my mother first aid, my father handed me $60. He said, here's some money in case you need it, because he knew we were going to Israel for treatment. And I remember touching money for the first time in my life. Because when you live in a bomb shelter, you don't go shopping. I never had to deal with money. We lived very poor. We didn't have any clothing. I remember going to school, I had 2 pairs of jeans that I alternated throughout the week, and I washed them on the weekend. And I remember when I was a little girl growing up in the bomb shelter, I had only 1 pair of pajamas between the age of 10 and 14. And as I grew, my mother had to cut my sleeves and to cut the pants so my hands can grow through my pajamas. So I didn't know, why do you need money for? So my father gives me the money, and he said, just in case you need it. And I put it in my pocket. And I went up to the Lebanese hospital, which was bombed out hospital that Israel had fixed. Israel had fixed up one room and put one Israeli doctor on duty and 2 Israeli nurses to take care of first aid, to give first aid to victims who were wounded in the war, so they may be to survive enough until they get to a hospital in Israel. So the doctor gave my mother first aid, and they put her in an Israeli-donated ambulance to drive us to the border, which was a 10-minute drive. The driver was a Lebanese driver. He was actually an acquaintance of the family. We got in the ambulance, and we literally flew to Israel under the bombs. We got to the Israeli border. They took her out of that ambulance and put her into another Israeli ambulance inside of Israel to drive us to the nearest hospital that can take care of my mother's injury. It was Itzfat. If any of you have visited Israel, you probably have visited the town of Itzfat. The drive was 1 hour. This time, the driver was an Israeli soldier dressed in a soldier attire. He was a reserve that was called 12 hours prior. He told me he had a daughter my age. He would talk to me as if I was his own daughter. He spoke to me with such compassion, with such respect, with such love. He can see the insecurity, the fear in my eyes. I was worried about my mother, worried about what was happening to her. She was unconscious, fading in and out in the back of the ambulance. That driver would talk to me. He turned on the radio. He would tell me how far Israel was advancing into Lebanon. He would talk to my mother, and she would make, painful noises because she was in pain. And he would tell her, don't worry, we'll be in the hospital just 5 minutes, just 10 minutes. And he must have said that 10 times just to calm her. And I remember getting into the hospital in Israel. And they opened the ambulance doors, and they took my mother into the emergency room. And I remember walking around to the Israeli driver to give him the money for the ambulance. And he asked me, what is this for? And I said, this is the money I have left, and it's your fee for the ambulance. And he looked at me and he said, you don't owe me any money. This is a free service from us to you. Please keep your money and take good care of your mother. And I was shocked because I could not believe his honesty and his integrity. He could have taken my money and partied all night, and I would not have known the difference. I expected to pay him because I had already paid the Lebanese driver half the money, $30, because he said this is what he needed for the 10-minute ride, the fee for the ambulance. Yet this Israeli driver who drove me for 1 hour didn't want to take any money. I became upset because I realized that the Lebanese driver robbed me. He stole my money. That was my first lesson in the difference of values and character between the Israeli people and the Arabic people.